May 1945, Camp Crossroads, New Mexico. The sun hammered down on cracked earth like molten iron. 24-year-old Friedrich Weber climbed down from the cattle car, his uniform torn and filthy, steel shackles cutting into his wrists, bracing himself for the brutality he'd been promised since childhood. Starvation. Beatings. Humiliation designed to break a soldier's spirit. His father's last words before the Eastern Front consumed him echoed in his mind: Americans are savages. They'll torture you for sport. Die like a soldier, not like a dog begging for scraps. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But when the mess hall doors opened that first evening, Friedrich's world stopped turning. Before him sat a metal tray loaded with foods he hadn't seen in 2 years, a thick pork chop with char marks from a real grill, buttered corn on the cob still steaming, mashed potatoes drowning in gravy, fresh bread with actual butter, and apple pie with a golden crust that released cinnamon-scented steam when he touched it. His hands trembled as he lifted the fork. Klaus Zimmermann, a hardened panzer commander twice Friedrich's age, struck the utensil from his grip. It clattered across the concrete floor. "Don't be a fool," Klaus hissed in rapid German. "It's poisoned. They want us to think we're safe before they kill us." But then Captain James Holloway sat down at their table, pulled an identical tray toward himself, cut into his pork chop, and ate. Slowly. Deliberately. Meeting Friedrich's eyes with an expression that held no hatred, no mockery, just a strange, unsettling neutrality. "Geneva Convention, Article 26, the captain said in flawless German. You eat what we eat. You sleep where we sleep. You're treated as soldiers, not animals." Everything Friedrich had been taught, everything he'd believed for 24 years, cracked like ice under a boot heel. And this meal, this single act of incomprehensible restraint, would force him to question every truth he'd ever been fed. But before we dive deeper into this incredible story that challenges everything we think we know about war and humanity, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to see how far these forgotten truths can travel. Because what happened in these camps wasn't just about food or comfort, it was about whether the law could hold when everything else had fallen apart. The New Mexico desert swallowed sound. That was what struck Friedrich first as the train's brakes screeched and the heavy doors rolled open with a metallic groan that echoed across emptiness. No birds sang. No wind moved. Just heat rising in visible waves off red-brown earth that stretched to mountains so distant they looked like watercolor bleeding into sky. He stepped onto American soil with legs that barely held him. 3 weeks in a transport ship's hold, 2 more days on trains that stopped and started without explanation, and now this, endless nothing punctuated by guard towers and barbed wire that glinted like spider silk in the afternoon glare. 23 men climbed down behind him. Infantry mostly, with a few Luftwaffe ground crew, a medic named Otto Engel who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite in the Ardennes, and Klaus Zimmermann, whose reputation had preceded him. Klaus had commanded a Tiger tank that allegedly destroyed 14 Allied vehicles before a Sherman put a shell through his engine block. He carried himself like a man who'd only surrendered because his ammunition had run out, not his will. Friedrich was nobody. A signals operator who'd spent the war in bunkers relaying coded messages he didn't understand, following orders that came from voices on crackling radios. He'd been captured during the final collapse, when his unit dissolved like salt and rain and surrender became the only mathematics that made sense. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They'd expected dogs. Beatings. The kind of treatment enemy soldiers deserved, the kind they'd been told to expect from Americans who supposedly valued nothing but money and violence. Friedrich's instructors in basic training had shown them propaganda films of American soldiers shooting prisoners, of mobs dragging captured Germans through city streets while crowds spat and threw stones. But the man walking toward them now wore a pressed uniform with captain's insignia and carried a clipboard instead of a rifle. Mid-30s, square-jawed, with the kind of controlled posture that suggested military discipline ran through his veins like blood. Captain James Holloway stopped 10 feet away and said in German so precise it could have come from a Berlin university, "I'm Captain Holloway. Welcome to Camp Crossroads. You'll be processed, assigned bunks, and issued camp regulations. Follow instructions. 'Cause no trouble. You'll find your treatment here corresponds exactly to what the Geneva Convention requires, nothing more, nothing less. No shouting. No weapons raised. No hands striking faces to establish dominance." Friedrich exchanged glances with Otto, whose remaining fingers clutched his small canvas bag like it might disappear. This had to be theater. The calm before the storm. They were being softened, prepared for whatever came next. Processing took 90 minutes. They were led to a wooden building that smelled of pine and disinfectant. One by one, they were photographed, fingerprinted, asked questions in German by a bored corporal who checked boxes on forms with mechanical efficiency. Name, rank, unit, date of capture. No one asked about ideology or beliefs or whether they'd been party members. Just facts, recorded and filed. Friedrich was assigned Barrack 7, Bunk 14. When he walked through the door, he stopped so abruptly that Otto nearly collided with him from behind. The room was clean. Not spotless, but clean in a way that suggested regular maintenance rather than neglect. 30 bunks arranged in neat rows, each with a thin mattress, a folded wool blanket, and a pillow that actually had stuffing in it. A pot-bellied stove sat in the center, already stocked with wood for when desert nights turned cold. Windows with actual glass, not just boards. A concrete floor swept free of debris. On Friedrich's pillow sat a bar of soap. Ivory brand, white as bone, wrapped in paper that crinkled when he picked it up. He held it to his nose and smelled something clean, chemical, utterly unlike the gray grit they'd been issued in the Wehrmacht that barely produced lather and left skin raw. "This is wrong," Klaus muttered from the bunk across from him. The older man's face had gone hard as granite. "This is all wrong. They're playing a game. Testing us. Seeing who breaks first. Maybe they're just following rules," Otto offered quietly, flexing his damaged hand. "Rules?" Klaus's laugh was bitter as copper. "There are no rules in war. Only winners and losers. And we lost." Friedrich said nothing. He set the soap down carefully and sat on the bunk, feeling the mattress compress beneath him. It was thin, probably horsehair and cotton, but it was a mattress. For 2 years he'd slept on wooden boards, concrete, frozen ground, whatever surface happened to be available. This felt obscene in its comfort. The dinner bell rang at 1800 hours, a real bell mounted outside the mess hall that some soldier rang with rhythmic precision. The prisoners filed out of their barracks and walked toward the long wooden building that dominated the camp's center. Friedrich's stomach had been a clenched fist for so long he'd almost forgotten what hunger felt like when it wasn't mixed with despair. The mess hall was enormous, filled with long tables and benches, lit by electric bulbs that hung from the ceiling in metal cages. American soldiers sat at some tables, eating and talking in low voices. Prisoners were directed to others. No separation beyond that. No special section for the defeated. The smell hit Friedrich like a physical blow. Meat cooking. Real meat, not the mystery tins or sawdust sausages that had sustained them during the final months. His mouth flooded with saliva so suddenly he had to swallow hard to keep from drooling like a dog. Sergeant William Thompson stood behind the serving line, a big man with forearms like hams and an easy smile that showed crooked teeth. He said something in English that Friedrich didn't understand, then gestured at the trays stacked at the line's beginning. Friedrich took one. Metal, divided into sections, worn from having been washed recently. He held it out with shaking hands. Thompson piled it high. A pork chop thick as Friedrich's palm, grilled with perfect char marks, juice pooling pink in the tray's corner. Corn on the cob, golden kernels glistening with melted butter. Mashed potatoes in a mound that received a ladle of brown gravy. 2 slices of white bread, soft and fresh, with an actual pat of butter on the side. And in the dessert section, a wedge of apple pie with a crust that looked like something from a dream, a memory of childhood so distant it might have belonged to someone else. Friedrich stared. His brain refused to process what his eyes reported. This couldn't be prison food. This was what officers ate. This was what civilians in peacetime ate, when the world wasn't burning. "Is this real?" he whispered in German, not meaning to speak aloud at all. Otto stood beside him, his own tray just as loaded, his face blank with incomprehension. Klaus had gone white, his jaw working like he was chewing words too dangerous to speak. They sat at a table in shocked silence. Friedrich set his tray down and just looked at it, afraid that touching anything would make it vanish like smoke. The corn radiated heat. The bread was soft enough to leave finger impressions. The pie's crust had been brushed with something that made it shine. Klaus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Don't touch it. It's poisoned. They're testing us, seeing who's stupid enough to trust them." "It's not poisoned," Otto said, but his voice held no conviction. "How do you know? How could you possibly know?" Klaus's eyes blazed. "This is psychological warfare. They give us this, we eat it, we get comfortable, we start to think maybe surrender wasn't so bad. And then they have us. We become collaborators without even realizing it." Friedrich wanted to believe Klaus was paranoid, that this was just food, that hungry men were being fed because the law said they should be. But everything in his training, everything in his experience, said this was impossible. Americans were the enemy. The enemy didn't feed you steak and pie. The enemy starved you, broke you, made you regret living. But then Captain Holloway sat down across from them. He carried his own tray, identical to theirs in every way. Same pork chop, same corn, same potatoes swimming in gravy, same pie. He set it down with deliberate care, picked up his knife and fork, cut into his meat with surgical precision, and ate. He chewed slowly, swallowed, took a sip from a glass of water, then cut another piece. His eyes never left theirs. "Geneva Convention, Article 26, Holloway said in that precise German. Prisoners of war shall be treated humanely and protected against acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. Article 26 specifically states that the basic daily food rations shall be sufficient in quantity, quality, and variety to keep prisoners in good health. The food you receive is identical to what American enlisted men receive. If you have complaints about quality or quantity, those complaints will be filed with the Red Cross inspector when he visits next month." He took another bite. Chewed. Swallowed. Waited. Friedrich's hands moved without his permission. He picked up his fork. Cut a small piece of pork chop. The meat was tender, the char adding a smoky flavor he'd almost forgotten existed. Fat rendered in his mouth. His throat worked to swallow. The piece went down. He waited for nausea, for poison to grip his stomach. Nothing happened except his body screaming for more. He took another bite. Then another. Beside him, Otto started eating too, tears streaming down his face as he shoveled mashed potatoes into his mouth with both hands. Even Klaus, after 5 full minutes of rigid resistance, picked up his fork and began to eat with mechanical precision, his face a mask of fury and confusion. The corn was sweet. The bread was soft. The pie tasted like apples and cinnamon in a world where wars didn't exist. Friedrich ate until his tray was empty, until his stomach hurt from being too full too fast, until he wanted to vomit and cry and scream all at once. Because if this was real, if this was just standard treatment, then what did that mean about everything else? If they'd lied about American camps, what else had they lied about? The first week passed like a fever dream. Friedrich moved through routines that felt lifted from some alternate reality where the war had different rules, different stakes, different endings. Wake at 0600. Roll call outside the barracks, names checked off on clipboards by guards who never raised their voices. Breakfast in the mess hall, where scrambled eggs and bacon appeared on trays with the same impossible regularity as the pork chops and roast beef and fried chicken that rotated through dinner menus. Work assignments began at 0800. Friedrich was assigned to the camp laundry facility, a concrete building filled with industrial washing machines that rumbled like distant thunder. 8 hours a day, he and 15 other prisoners hauled soiled uniforms and linens through cycles of washing, drying, folding. The work was monotonous but not backbreaking. No one stood over them with clubs. No one screamed or struck or made them work until they collapsed. And at the end of each day, they were paid 80 cents in camp scrip for 8 hours of work. Thin paper vouchers stamped with the Camp Crossroads seal and the value in large numbers. Friedrich held his first week's wages in his palm like they might catch fire. $4.80. More money than he'd ever possessed as a soldier, where pay was theoretical and usually months behind. On Saturday, the canteen opened for 2 hours. Friedrich walked through the door expecting a bare shelf, maybe some rotting vegetables or stale bread. Instead, he found cigarettes, candy bars, writing paper, pencils, playing cards, soap, toothpaste, magazines in both English and German, and 100 other small luxuries that prison camps weren't supposed to contain. He bought toothpaste, Colgate in a metal tube that felt heavy with possibility, a bar of chocolate, 3 pieces of writing paper and a pencil. The clerk, a private who looked barely old enough to shave, counted out his change without comment and handed him a paper bag for his purchases. Friedrich walked back to the barracks holding that bag like it contained diamonds. He sat on his bunk and ate the chocolate slowly, letting it melt on his tongue, tasting sweetness that memory said couldn't be real. Otto bought a harmonica. Klaus bought nothing, standing in the corner of the canteen with his arms crossed, watching everyone else with barely contained contempt. "You're all fools," he said that night after lights out, his voice cutting through the darkness. "They're buying you. Every meal, every small comfort, every false kindness. They're making you forget who you are, what you fought for. You're becoming their pets." "We're surviving," Otto said quietly from his bunk. "No. You're collaborating. And when this is over, when we go home, everyone will know what you became." Friedrich said nothing. He lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile the man he'd been with the man he was becoming. A man who ate steak and bought chocolate and felt his body growing stronger instead of weaker. A man who was supposed to be suffering but instead felt something closer to relief. He watched Captain Holloway constantly now. Studied him the way you'd study a puzzle you couldn't solve. The captain moved through the camp with the same mechanical efficiency every day, clipboard in hand, checking rosters, inspecting facilities, enforcing regulations with absolute consistency. Friedrich learned things about him through overheard conversations and careful observation. Holloway's family owned a farm in Iowa. He'd taught German literature at a small college before the war. His younger brother had died at Normandy, shot by a German sniper while wading through surf that ran red with blood. That last detail sat in Friedrich's chest like a stone. This man, whose brother died because of people like Friedrich, who had every reason to hate them, to want them to suffer, treated them with a fairness that felt more disturbing than cruelty ever could. One evening, Friedrich found himself alone in the laundry building after everyone else had left. He was folding the last load of towels, taking his time because returning to the barracks meant facing Klaus's contempt or Otto's quiet sadness. The door opened and Holloway walked in, doing his evening inspection round. He nodded at Friedrich. Said nothing. Began checking the machines, making notes on his clipboard. Friedrich's mouth opened before his brain could stop it. "Why?" he asked in German. Holloway looked up. "Why what? Why do this? Treat us like we're human. Your brother died. We killed him. You should want us to suffer." Holloway was quiet for a long moment. He set his clipboard down on a folding table and met Friedrich's eyes with that same neutral expression that revealed nothing. "I wanted exactly that," Holloway said finally. "When I got the telegram about Thomas, I wanted every German soldier to die screaming. I volunteered for this assignment because I thought I could make that happen within the rules. Find small ways to make you hurt." Friedrich's throat tightened. "But then I read the convention," Holloway continued. Actually read it, every article, every clause. And I realized that if I started bending those rules, even slightly, even for what felt like good reasons, then I became exactly what we're supposed to be fighting against. The law doesn't work if it only applies when it's convenient. He picked up his clipboard again. You didn't kill my brother. Some other German with a rifle killed my brother. And he was probably following orders just like you followed orders. Hate doesn't need my help to spread. But maybe law does. He walked out, leaving Friedrich alone with towels that smelled like soap and questions that had no answers. The second week brought mail call. A Red Cross truck arrived with sacks of letters that had been filtered through sensors and forwarding systems, taking months to find their intended recipients. Friedrich didn't expect anything. His mother was dead, killed in a bombing raid on Hamburg. His father had been missing on the Eastern Front for over a year, presumed dead in the vast Soviet meat grinder. But when the corporal called Weber, Friedrich, and held up an envelope, Friedrich's hands shook so hard he could barely take it. The handwriting belonged to his sister Anneliese. He hadn't heard from her since before his capture. The letter had been written in February, 4 months ago. He sat on his bunk and opened it with fingers that refused to work properly. She was alive. Living in the British occupation zone with their uncle. The city was rubble. Food was scarce, but the British were organizing distribution. She was working as a translator. She asked if he was alive, if he was hurt, if he had any idea when he might come home. Friedrich read it 3 times. Then he pulled out one of his pieces of precious writing paper and a pencil and began to compose a response. Words came slowly. How did you explain this? How did you tell your sister that you were a prisoner of war being fed better than she was, that you had chocolate while she scraped by on rations, that your captors treated you with more dignity than your own commanders ever had? He wrote, I am alive. I am unhurt. I am being treated according to international law. I hope you are safe. I hope I see you again. He couldn't write more. Couldn't find words for the guilt that sat in his chest like lead. That night, Otto played his harmonica softly after lights out. Simple folk songs about rivers and forests and home. Several men cried quietly in the darkness. Klaus lay rigid and silent, radiating disapproval. Friedrich stared at the ceiling and wondered what it meant to survive when the world you understood had dissolved like sugar and rain. 3 weeks into their imprisonment, Captain Holloway assembled all the prisoners in the camp theater. The building was small and utilitarian, with wooden benches arranged in rows facing a white screen. A 16mm projector sat in the back, already threaded and humming. Friedrich filed in with the others, confusion rippling through the group. No one had told them what this was about. No one had prepared them. Holloway stood at the front, his face carved from granite. He waited until everyone was seated, until the last whispered conversation died into silence. Then he spoke in that same level German he always used, but something was different now. His voice carried an edge Friedrich had never heard before, something raw beneath the professional restraint. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks ago, Holloway said. Each word fell like a hammer. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich no longer exists. The room erupted in noise. Men shouting questions, denials, demands for proof. Klaus was on his feet, face twisted with fury. Lies. Propaganda. Holloway waited for the chaos to subside. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. Just stood there with his clipboard in his stone face until shame at their own outburst drove the prisoners back into their seats. What you are about to see, Holloway continued, are newsreels filmed by Allied forces during the liberation of concentration camps. You will watch all of it. You will not leave early. You will not close your eyes. Because whether you knew or didn't know, whether you participated or just followed orders, you need to understand what was done in your names. He nodded to the projectionist. The lights dimmed. The projector clicked to life. Bergen-Belsen appeared first. Friedrich's mind tried to reject what his eyes showed him. Mountains of bodies, skeletal and twisted, stacked like firewood because there were too many to bury properly. Living prisoners who looked like animated corpses, hollow-eyed and swaying, their bodies so wasted that bones pressed against skin like tent poles. British soldiers wearing masks against the stench, using bulldozers to push the dead into mass graves while camp survivors watched with expressions too broken for tears. Then Buchenwald. Dachau. Auschwitz. Rows of ovens. Piles of shoes. Children's toys mixed with human ash. Guard towers and barbed wire and gas chambers disguised as showers. Survivors showing tattoos, telling stories through translators, their voices flat with trauma so deep it had carved away everything human and left only survival mechanisms still twitching. Friedrich lasted 12 minutes before his stomach revolted. He stumbled up the aisle toward the exit but found it blocked by an American guard who shook his head once. No leaving. Captain's orders. He made it to the corner of the room before he vomited onto the wooden floor. Bent double, hands on knees, retching until nothing came up but bile and horror. Otto was crying openly, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Klaus sat rigid, face white as bone, jaw clenched so hard Friedrich could see muscles jumping beneath skin. The reels kept playing. 20 minutes. 30. 40. An endless parade of evidence that couldn't be denied, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be reconciled with any version of reality that made sense. Friedrich's brain tried desperately to find escape routes. He was just a signals operator. He never saw these camps. He only relayed messages, just numbers and coordinates, just following orders. How could he have known? What could one soldier have done even if he'd known? But he remembered things now. Conversations he hadn't paid attention to. Jokes about special treatment and resettlement that had seemed merely crude, not prophetic. Trains loaded with people that never came back. Questions he'd never asked because asking questions wasn't what good soldiers did. When the reels finally ended and the lights came up, Friedrich couldn't stand. His legs wouldn't work. He sat slumped in the corner, staring at nothing, while other prisoners filed out in shocked silence. Klaus walked past him without looking, moving like a man in a trance. Otto stopped, reached down a hand to help Friedrich up. His face was destroyed, eyes red and swollen, the harmonica hanging from his pocket like an accusation. "Did you know?" Otto whispered. "No," Friedrich said. His voice sounded like gravel. "I didn't know. Not like that. Not. But you should have," Otto finished. "We all should have." They walked back to the barracks in silence. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. Friedrich's mind kept trying to reconcile the steak he'd eaten with the skeletons in the newsreels. The chocolate he'd bought with the children's shoes piled beside ovens. The gentle treatment he'd received with the gas chambers disguised as showers. That night he couldn't sleep. Lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling while questions without answers circled his brain like vultures. Around him, other men cried or prayed or lay as silent as he did. Klaus never came back to the barracks. Friedrich learned later that he'd tried to hang himself from a beam in the laundry building. Guards had cut him down in time. Friedrich understood the impulse. Death would be easier than living with this knowledge. But then he thought about Captain Holloway, whose brother had died fighting people like Friedrich, who had every reason to want them to suffer, who instead enforced the law with mechanical precision because the alternative was becoming what he fought against. And Friedrich realized that the steak and the chocolate and the gentle treatment weren't rewards. They were tests. Tests to see if defeated men could be treated humanely even when they came from a system that had treated humans like refuse. Tests to see if the law could hold when everything else had failed. He'd passed the test without knowing he was being tested. And now he had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. At dawn, Friedrich found Captain Holloway in his office, working through paperwork by lamplight. The captain looked up when Friedrich knocked, gestured him inside. Friedrich stood at attention, words sticking in his throat. Finally, he forced them out in broken English he'd been learning from other prisoners. "I not know what to do." What to say? Holloway was quiet for a long moment. Then he responded in German. You can't change what happened. You can't undo what was done. But you're alive, and being alive means you have to choose what comes next. How? Friedrich's voice cracked. How do I live knowing that? The same way I live knowing my brother died in the surf at Normandy, Holloway said quietly. You bear it. You carry it. And you make damn sure nothing like it ever happens again. He stood, walked to his filing cabinet, pulled out a folder. Red Cross is organizing relief operations for displaced persons. They need German speakers who understand how bureaucracies work, who can help survivors navigate the system. It's not redemption. But it's something real. He held out the folder. Friedrich took it with shaking hands. Inside were forms, instructions, contact information. A way forward that wasn't death or denial. Why are you helping me? Friedrich whispered. Because someone has to build the peace, Holloway said. And it can't just be the victors. It has to be people on both sides who understand what happens when law fails, when restraint dies, when we stop seeing each other as human. He sat back down, returned to his paperwork. You're dismissed. Friedrich walked out into dawn light that hurt his eyes. He held the folder against his chest and felt its weight like a physical thing. Around him, the camp was waking. Men filing toward the mess hall for breakfast. Guards changing shifts. The mechanical routine of a system that treated enemy soldiers with dignity even when they came from a nation that had forgotten what dignity meant. Friedrich had no idea what came next. No idea if he could actually help anyone, if he could carry this knowledge without breaking, if redemption was even possible for someone like him. But he knew that Captain Holloway had given him something more valuable than steak or chocolate or gentle treatment. He'd given him a choice. And for the first time since his capture, Friedrich understood that surviving meant more than just staying alive. It meant deciding what kind of man he would become in the ruins of everything he'd believed. 10 years later, Friedrich Weber stood in a conference room in Geneva, Switzerland, addressing a gathering of international relief workers and legal scholars. His hair had started to gray at the temples. Lines had etched themselves around his eyes from years of reading case files and witnessing pain. But his voice was steady, his German accented English clear and precise. The work of reconciliation, he said, is never finished. In 10 years with the Red Cross Search Bureau, my team has facilitated over 2,000 family reunifications. We've helped process hundreds of thousands of documentation requests. We've trained 300 new workers in 15 countries. He paused, looking at the faces in the audience. Some were former enemies, some former allies, all now colleagues in the work of peace. But the number I want you to remember isn't 2,000. It's the 37,000 cases still open. 37,000 people still searching for lost family members. Still hoping. Still waiting. Some of these cases will never close. Some families will never be whole again. That's the truth we must carry. He pulled out a worn leather journal, the one Captain Holloway had given him before he left Camp Crossroads. The pages were full now, hundreds of names in careful handwriting, each one representing a small victory or a crushing defeat. Captain James Holloway gave me this journal in 1945, Friedrich continued. He told me to write down the names of people I helped, so I would remember why I did this work when it got hard. I've filled 3 journals since then. I have the names of 2,000 people who found each other. I also have the names of 4,000 people who searched and never found what they were looking for. He set the journal on the podium. I was a signals operator in the Wehrmacht. I never pulled a trigger in combat, never saw the concentration camps until Allied newsreels forced me to watch. I was just following orders, just doing my job. Just one small piece of a vast machine of death that murdered millions. The room was silent. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Friedrich had learned that truth made people uncomfortable. That was fine. Truth should be uncomfortable. When I was captured and sent to Camp Crossroads, I expected brutality. I expected starvation and beatings and all the horrors I'd been told to expect from American savages. He smiled slightly, the expression holding no humor. Instead, I got steak dinners. I got paid work. I got treatment according to the Geneva Convention. And it shattered everything I believed. He picked up the journal again, held it like a sacred text. Captain Holloway taught me that law is more powerful than hate. That mercy isn't weakness. That treating enemies with dignity isn't the same as forgiveness, it's the foundation of peace. He showed me that the choice between revenge and restraint is the choice between civilization and barbarism. Friedrich looked directly at a group of young German students in the front row, there to learn about post-war reconciliation efforts. Some of you will ask if I've earned redemption. The answer is no. I will never earn redemption for being part of that system, for following those orders, for failing to ask the questions that might have made a difference. But redemption isn't the goal. Responsibility is. I survived, so I have a responsibility to do something useful with that survival. That's all any of us can do. After the presentation, a young German woman approached him. She was maybe 23, born after the war ended, carrying the weight of inherited shame that Friedrich recognized in every young German he met. Herr Weber, she said quietly, how do you live with the guilt? How do you get up every morning knowing what Germany did? Friedrich thought about this question. He'd been asked variations of it hundreds of times over the years. You don't live with it comfortably, he said finally. You carry it. You let it inform your choices without letting it paralyze you. You acknowledge what happened without trying to minimize it or explain it away. And then you do the work. But how do you know you're doing enough? You don't. You never do enough. There's no enough when millions died. But you do what you can anyway, because the alternative is giving up, and giving up is the one thing we can't afford. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. That evening, Friedrich sat in his hotel room and wrote a letter to Anneliese. His sister had done well in Hamburg, had risen through the British Occupation Authority to become a senior administrator in the new German government's refugee services. She had 2 children now, was teaching them English and German and the importance of questioning authority, of standing up for what was right even when it was hard. Dear Anneliese, I spoke at the conference today about reconciliation work. Afterward, a young woman asked me how to live with guilt. I gave her the answer we've learned: you carry it, you let it inform your choices, and you do the work anyway. But here's what I didn't tell her, what I can only tell you: some days I still wake up and think about the steak. The first meal at Camp Crossroads, when everything I believed shattered. I think about Captain Holloway sitting across from me, eating the same food, teaching me that law could be more powerful than hate. I think about how he had every reason to want us to suffer, how his brother died at Normandy, how he could have made our lives hell within the rules if he'd wanted to. But he chose restraint. He chose to follow the law even when his heart wanted revenge. And that choice saved my life in ways that have nothing to do with physical survival. I've helped 2,000 families find each other. That's 2,000 small lights in an ocean of darkness. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's real, and it matters, and I can do it because someone showed me that there's another way. The war ended 10 years ago, but the work of peace continues. I'll keep doing this work until I can't anymore. Because that's what you do when you've been shown mercy you didn't deserve, you pass it forward. With love, Friedrich. He sealed the letter and set it aside for mourning. Then he opened his current journal and added today's date. 3 new cases today. 2 families still searching. 1 young woman asking how to carry guilt. He wrote it all down carefully, preserving the details, the names, the small moments that added up to a life spent trying to build something better from ruins. 23 years after the war ended, Friedrich Weber received an invitation to speak at the dedication of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Research Center. He was 68 now, officially retired from the Red Cross but still consulting on difficult cases, still training new workers, still carrying names and journals that had multiplied to fill a shelf in his study. The invitation came from an unexpected source: Sarah Stein, the 8-year-old girl he'd helped reunite with her mother in 1945. She was 31 now, a historian specializing in displaced persons and post-war reconstruction, married with children of her own. Dear Herr Weber, you probably don't remember me. I was one of thousands of cases you worked on. But you changed my life. Because of your work, I got to grow up with my mother. I got to have a family. I got to become someone other than a victim. I'm helping establish the Memorials Research Center, and I want stories of people who chose to help rebuild after the war. Your story matters. Not because it absolves anything, but because it shows that people can change. That mercy can be more powerful than revenge. That the choice to help is always available, even to those who've been complicit in terrible things. Would you be willing to share your story? With gratitude, Sarah Stein. Friedrich stood at the dedication ceremony, looking out at an audience that included survivors, historians, students, and other relief workers. He saw Otto Engel in the front row, still alive at 70, still working with displaced persons services. Klaus Zimmermann had died 3 years earlier, but his daughter attended in his place, carrying her father's own journals filled with names of people he'd helped. I was an enemy soldier, Friedrich began, his English now fluent after decades of use. I fought for evil without fully understanding what I was part of. When I was captured, I expected punishment. Instead, I received mercy. Not because I deserved it, but because someone believed that law was more important than revenge. He told them about Camp Crossroads. About steak dinners and Geneva Conventions and Captain Holloway's quiet insistence that treating enemies humanely wasn't weakness but the foundation of civilization. About the newsreels that shattered his world and the choice to build rather than die. Captain Holloway died 15 years ago, Friedrich continued. Heart attack at his desk, still working, still enforcing the rules he believed kept us human. I wrote to his family afterward. His wife told me something I think about often. She said James believed that the test of any principle is whether you follow it when it's hard, when your heart wants revenge, when the law protects people you hate. He pulled out the original journal, worn and faded now. I've helped over 5,000 families reunite in 23 years. I've processed hundreds of thousands of cases. I've trained hundreds of workers. None of it balances the scales. None of it earns redemption. But every single name in this journal represents a choice. A choice to help rather than hurt. To build rather than destroy. To pass forward the mercy I was given. Friedrich looked directly at the young people in the audience, the next generation who would carry this history forward. Some of you come from families of survivors. Some from families of perpetrators. Some from families of bystanders. All of you inherit a world shaped by choices made decades ago. The question isn't whether you're responsible for what happened before you were born. The question is what you'll do with the world you've inherited. He held up the journal. This is my answer. Names. Thousands of names. People helped. Families reunited. Small victories that don't fix what was broken but matter anyway. Find your own answer. Your own way to build. Your own way to ensure that never again means something more than words. After the ceremony, an elderly man approached Friedrich. He was tall and weather-worn, with kind eyes and a familiar jawline. Herr Weber. I'm Thomas Holloway, Jr. James Holloway's nephew, named after his brother who died at Normandy. Friedrich's throat tightened. My uncle wrote about you in his letters home, Thomas continued. About a German signals operator who chose to help survivors, who understood the difference between mercy and justice. He said you gave him hope that the law he believed in actually worked. That treating enemies with dignity wasn't naive, it was the only thing that might break the cycle. He pulled out a photograph. Captain Holloway in his uniform, standing in front of Camp Crossroads, clipboard in hand, expression serious but not unkind. He'd want you to have this, Thomas said. As thanks for proving he was right. Friedrich took the photograph with trembling hands. Looked at the face of the man who'd saved his life by enforcing law over revenge, who'd shown him that there was another way, who'd given him a journal and told him to write it down so he wouldn't forget why he did this work. Your uncle was the best man I ever knew, Friedrich said quietly. He taught me that mercy isn't weakness. That following the law when your heart wants revenge is the hardest and most important thing a person can do. He said the same about you, Thomas replied. Said you proved that even people who'd been complicit in evil could choose to build something better. That redemption wasn't the goal, but responsibility was. They stood together for a long moment, nephew of a man who'd died fighting Friedrich's side, and a former enemy soldier who'd spent 2 decades trying to build peace from ruins. Thank you for carrying forward his work, Thomas said finally. Thank you for sharing your uncle's memory, Friedrich replied. That night, Friedrich sat in his hotel room and wrote the final entry in his current journal. He was on his 7th volume now, thousands of names accumulated over 23 years of work. Today I spoke at the memorial dedication. Sarah Stein was there, the 8-year-old I helped reunite with her mother in 1945. She's a historian now, married, happy, alive because someone chose to enforce law over revenge. Captain Holloway's nephew gave me a photograph. I look at it now and remember the man who showed me there was another way. Who taught me that survival means responsibility. That mercy isn't the same as forgiveness, but it's the foundation of peace. I'm 68 years old. I've helped thousands of families. I've failed thousands more. The scales will never balance. Redemption remains impossible. But the work continues, passed forward to the next generation, carried by people who understand that the choice to help is always available. I was an enemy soldier who expected cruelty and received steak. That single meal changed everything. Not because it made me a good person, but because it showed me that law could be more powerful than hate. That treating enemies with dignity wasn't naive, it was the foundation of civilization. Captain Holloway is dead. Klaus is dead. Millions who should have lived are dead. But Sarah Stein is alive. 2,000 families are together because I chose to help. The work continues because someone showed me mercy I didn't deserve and told me to pass it forward. That's the only answer I have. The only redemption available to someone like me. Not forgiveness, but responsibility. Not absolution, but work. Not balance, but building. The steak still tastes like treason. The chocolate still feels like theft. The mercy still confuses me. But I understand now what Captain Holloway understood: the law doesn't work if it only applies when it's convenient. Mercy doesn't mean anything if we only extend it to people who deserve it. I survived. So I have to do something with that survival. I chose to help. That's all. That's everything. Friedrich Weber, 1968. He closed the journal and set it on the shelf with the others. 7 volumes of names. Thousands of families. Decades of work. Not enough. Never enough. But real and meaningful, and the best answer he'd found to the impossible question of how to live with being shown mercy you didn't deserve. The next morning, he would fly home to Germany. Return to his consulting work. Continue training new workers. Keep adding names to journals. Keep building bridges between enemies who might learn to see each other as human. Keep passing forward the mercy he'd been given, one case at a time, one family at a time, one choice at a time. Because that's what you do when someone shows you there's another way. You follow it. You build it. You pass it forward. Until the day you die, and someone else picks up the work, and the cycle continues. Not revenge, but restraint. Not hatred, but law. Not destruction, but building. That was Captain Holloway's gift. That was Friedrich's answer. That was the only redemption available, choosing to help, over and over, for the rest of your life. Friedrich Weber's story reminds us that the most powerful weapon against hatred isn't revenge, but the consistent application of law and human dignity. Captain Holloway could have made those prisoners suffer. He had every reason to want them broken. But he chose restraint. And that choice created ripples that spread across decades, helping thousands of families, training hundreds of workers, building peace from the ashes of war. The steak dinner wasn't a reward. It was a test. A test to see if defeated enemies could be treated humanely. A test to see if law could hold when everything else had failed. A test that Friedrich passed without knowing he was being tested, and that changed the trajectory of his entire life. This isn't a story about redemption. It's a story about responsibility. About what we do with the mercy we're given. About choosing to build rather than destroy, to help rather than hurt, to pass forward what we've received even when we didn't deserve it. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten histories that challenge everything we think we know about war, peace, and what it means to be human. Drop a comment telling me, what would you do if you discovered everything you believed was a lie? How do you rebuild when your entire world is shattered? And remember, the work of peace is never finished. Someone, somewhere, is still searching for lost family. Someone is still carrying guilt that feels unbearable. Someone is still trying to figure out how to live with surviving when millions didn't. Be the person who helps. Be the person who chooses law over revenge. Be the person who passes forward the mercy you've received. That's how we honor the Friedrich Webers and Captain Holloways and Sarah Steins of history. That's how we ensure that never again means something more than words. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.